what an insult generally is someone taking their own anger and dissatisfaction and displacing it and putting it onto you. So are you going to then pick up that ember of resentment and hold it and wait for the right moment to like hurl it back at someone? You can, of course, then you're the one getting burned that whole time.
Jeff, the ironic topic of this conversation is difficult conversations.
Yeah, I hope it isn't one, but I'm holding out that possibility. So,
Well, the premise is that we need to be having more difficult conversations. So maybe I'll just be purposefully difficult
yeah,
for your own edification.
you're a real dick.
The end.
Okay.
That's how you have difficult
Yeah,
conversations.
you start with an insult.
Drop a schoolyard insult
Yeah.
out of here.
But your psychological immune system is so exposed to insult that now you've developed enough psychological antibodies for them. So that's part of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is one of the base premises, is that we do have a form of psychological immune system that we can bolster. So why don't you start there?
Sure.
With like what has happened in our society that we are so psychologically sensitive to difficult conversations?
Yeah. So this is where there is an evolutionary mismatch. So we evolved not without conflict, but we were able to resolve those conflicts because we could confront one another face to face and actually talk them through such that we find compromise and common ground. Okay.
Well, and I would say that we're talking like Paleolithic evolution here.
Sure.
You didn't have a choice. I mean, what were you going to do? Go leave the group and like wander off to be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger?
I'm going to send you invidious smoke signals.
I mean, we evolved in groups of 20 to 120-ish. So you had all of these relationships that you had to maintain and manage. And you didn't have a choice. You had to have difficult conversations. It's not like in those groups, everyone just magically got along all the time.
That's right. And community was adaptive. And now, of course, in the era of the sanctification of the individual, we've become more socially isolated. And there's a lot of anonymous digital warriorship, right? So we sit behind screens and, we shoot off, vitriolic barbs and ad hominem at each other without any accountability. And that is an artifice of modernity that just was not the way that we evolved. So,
and I would add to that, you don't quote unquote need anyone the way that you did back then.
Well, I think that is the perception, but I would say, yes, you can order up like Uber Eats, you don't need to rely on.
You can get into you can argue with your neighbor, have a massive falling out, and never have to rely on each other again.
That's true, sadly.
Yeah.
Until you do,
And then you're surprised.
Yeah. Right. So I think, we build, let me just kind of explain this slightly metaphorically. Like we build our physiological immune system by like eating some dirt, right? So through, literally through exposures to low grade pathogens, over time, such that we build the antibodies for those pathogens and we remember them. Our bodies remember them, which is just the most unbelievable facet of the human immune system.
I am against conversational vaccination.
That's right. Well, I mean, vaccines are actually a great example because generally, like you look at like a chickenpox vaccine, for example, it uses like an attenuated virus, right? And it gives you sort of a low grade exposure to that attenuated virus such that you develop those antibodies. And the next time you come into contact with the varicella virus or whatever it is, the chickenpox virus, you have immunity. And so apply that to your psychology, So, okay, well, a certain amount of exposure to controversy or criticism or even insult can inure you to the power of that insult. And, this is a very, very stoic, concept. Like the best way to disarm an insult is to be unmoved by it, right? Be like the rock. That is getting pounded by the ocean waves. The rock never really feels insulted. It feels, it's just there and feeling strong. So, there are many of these principles. I think the Greeks called it euthymia, which is this kind of unflappable emotional state where, you're not really moved by insult. And, if you think about it, what an insult generally is someone taking their own anger and dissatisfaction and displacing it and putting it onto you. So are you going to then pick up that ember of resentment and hold it and wait for the right moment to like hurl it back at someone? You can, of course, then you're the one getting burned that whole time. So, I went through this personal experience, and maybe, we can talk about it a little bit, around Commune. But, 3 years ago, I was incredibly sensitive to criticism and insult, and I, certainly received my fair share of it. And, let's talk about maybe the kind of the origins of commusings, because this is kind of was my my experience in the arena
Yeah.
with the Lions.
So, well, I also want to point toward the direction that I think we're going, because this just leaving it at that stoic nature aspect makes you kind of feel like, I can just take the insult. That's not necessarily having where we're going with this is like, that's one aspect of being able to have difficult conversations, is being able to eat a little bit of dirt.
Eat a little bit of dirt. And, this doesn't justify like odious behavior by anyone. It's like, neglect and abuse, and racism, et cetera. There is behavior that you might be the victim of that, I'm certainly not saying that, you can build an immune system that is essentially immune to these forms of incredibly odious behavior. I'm not justifying that, but I am saying that there's a lot that one can do to kind of build a sense of euthymia or unflappability such that you can step into stressful conversations without being kind of dysregulated from a nervous system perspective.
Great. Okay, so stepping back to spring of 2020, that was a very tumultuous time. Trump, vaccines, origin of the virus, the summer of racial reckoning.
QAnon, the election, and there was so much on offer. There was so much fodder out there, and incredibly in a time where a lot of people were very on edge and triggered.
Yeah, and in our community, the health and wellness community, it was a very interesting time, because I think for the first time we felt our own community being driven apart by wedge issues. Mm-hmm. Our own kind of forms of wedge issues, whether that was vaccines or whatever it was. And so I asked you to kind of step up and write a weekly, well, just to start, a column, kind of an essay on some of these topics, because you were creating some short videos, you were doing some interesting thinking on them around the idea of like, what is the middle path through all of this for our wider community? And that became Commusings, which has been a weekly essay that for at least 18 months, you wrote every single one of them every Sunday. They got published in full, like it was just an email with 1,000 to 2,000 words in them. And the interesting thing was, yes, what you had to say, but also the feedback and your interaction with the feedback that came with them. Because I forget why, but the first few times we included your email address, because I guess we felt that it wasn't worth just sending out an opinion and not inviting other opinions back. So why don't you talk
Yeah.
about what came back?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm not sure I'll ever forgive you. Um, and it's been a great blessing. I mean, yes, very naively agreed to write this weekly essay. Um, and then, like, a month in, found myself over a literary barrel of sorts. It was like 2,000 words again. Um, and, like we said, there was plenty of fodder in 2020, like, fortunately for commusings, unfortunately for the rest of the world, perhaps, but there was plenty to write about. And, we're a health and wellness company, but we always, one of the kind of missions of the company was to bridge, personal and societal well-being. So we were tackling these very inflammatory social issues that I think, really distinguishes ourselves from the general wellness community. It's easy to not write about them or ignore them, but we were like literally walking right into the jaws of the national reckoning on racial justice. We were talking about, Trump and the election and QAnon and the pandemic and all of this stuff that was, incredibly thorny. And so, yeah, we deploy these essays every Sunday. Yeah, I don't remember the origin or the reason why we included my email in the very beginning, but come Monday morning, the responses, would be kind of cresting the bow of my inbox, and to be fair, most of them were very encouraging. And I mean, I think this was your point. Your point was like, Jeff, people are feeling very isolated, they're very lonely. And by, creating sort of these vessels for emotions, we can share them such that we can all feel less alone. And so in that case, in that sense, we were accomplishing what we set out to do.
Well, and I think also people felt that there was only always two sides to these things and they had to fall on one side or the other.
Mhm.
And I asked you to be yourself, but with courage, to go and make arguments that validated aspects of multiple sides of the argument. And what was very interesting was that often when people would fixate on one aspect of what you were putting forward and not the other, and then you felt, I think, an obligation to have conversations with those people because they weren't getting kind of the full picture that you were trying to lay down. And the people who were very, I think, positive were the ones that said, wow, it's really refreshing that someone can stand up and say, yes, X, Y, and Z about racial justice, and let's also look at, these statistics and these statistics in one article or
Yeah.
in one essay. But then there were those who were just couldn't even see you offering steel manning, and we'll get into straw manning and steel manning, both sides of the argument. And so those were the conversations that I think you felt most obligated to have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in an era where there is very, very little nuance and a lot of polarization, we were trying to sort of really cultivate this middle path that where you could appreciate, one person's opinion in equal proportion to your own, or find or hold, two counter opposed thoughts at the same time, and that seems to be rarer and rarer in our time. So that this was the goal.
I mean, it might have been rare. I did pull a great F. Scott Fitzgerald quote from 1936. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function.
Yeah, I mean, that is a fantastic quote and so applicable to the moment, because I I think that this our inability to hold two opposing thoughts is really corrosive to society right now, and it leads to kind of an erosion of the ability to find any sort of common ground or make any, like everything good that's ever happened has been predicated on our ability to cooperate flexibly and at scale.
Well, and cooperate almost always means holding in some degree two opposing, continuing to see value in two opposing ideas such that you aren't only willing to accept one side of the equation.
Yeah. So like more kind of specifically as it pertained to commusing. So I started to write these essays, and then, there would be, like you said, people would come back like extremely critical at times. And over 2,000 words, there's plenty of opportunity to find issue with a certain idea or a certain turn of phrase or word usage, that might eclipse the overarching, point or intention of the article. So like I remember I wrote one around 4th of July, 2020, and I called it Interdependence Day. And I think there was like some metaphor that I was making about like democracy and driving on the 101 on a highway, where essentially it's like the highway presents really a true meritocracy. Like no one gets downtown before anyone else, and if you drive recklessly, you're not only putting other people's lives at danger, you're putting yourself, like your own life, at danger. And it is a sort of, prosaic example, if you will, of the confluence of your own best self-interest and the communal interest is one and the same. So this is what I was talking about. I kind of set it against, I think, the Declaration of Independence. And I had used, I think, the phrase, the founding fathers, scrawled these ideas on a parchment. And over the last 250 years, we've been trying to align the human condition, with our highest principles. And that has been a jagged journey. But there was a woman that came back, and she found the use of founding fathers, like that phrase, like she found it very, very triggering. And so we had an exchange over email that was like at least thoughtful. And so, eventually I was like, you know what? Do you want to just get on a Zoom call? And I didn't really have plans to scale that idea very at that juncture. And she did. And this was sort of the beta test of it. And I heard her out, and this was an African-American woman from New York. And, she was like, listen, they weren't my founding fathers. And, candidly, they didn't offer me any independence. And I heard her, and I said, I kind of rejoined. I was like, listen, this is just a phrase. My intention here was obviously to say, like, the ideas that are represented in some of our founding documents are some of the best ideas that have ever, been served as a framework for society. And, we didn't offer them to everyone. And she's like, yeah, but I don't care. You need to expire that phrase. You need to stop using that founding fathers. And so I actually thought about it for a while. And at first, like, I was a little bit defensive. I'm like, she's really just not getting my intention here. And then I just started thinking, like, we expire phrases all the time. And, when we say things or write things, we might imbue them with a certain meaning, but someone else might understand them in a different way. I think about, like, from the river to the sea, like right now. It's like that's being said all over college campuses. And, and it might not mean for the people saying them, we want to annihilate all Jews in the state of Israel. But that is actually how a lot of people hear it. And for me, I think that phrase should be expired. And I was wanting to, and in the end, I was willing to expire the phrase founding fathers for me. I
But
was
it was
willing.
after a conversation, and in what I would say an open, honest conversation where you approached it not as like, okay, well, I just need to be pushed over here, or no, I'm gonna push back. You, you approach the conversation to listen, and I think that's one of the things that when we don't have a psychological immune system, and so we are so triggered in a difficult conversation that we go into fight flight kind of mode, we're no longer listening.
Correct. And I think what I began to learn over time, because then, I had many, many, many more of these Zoom calls around all sorts of different topics, were certain techniques that were very, very helpful for having stressful conversations. And honestly, I started to think about stressful conversations kind of within the parentheses of adversity mimetics, the same way I think about like fasting and cold water therapy and high intensity interval training and other forms of sort of good stress. I started thinking about there is actually a methodology for having stressful conversations. Now, at that point, I didn't know about nonviolent communication. You were much more versed in kind of the work of Marshall Rosenberg, which is this whole approach, basically having stressful conversations. And I was sort of instinctually going along with the flow of these conversations and sort of picking up techniques as I went. So, these conversations begin to take on such a similar pattern where, I'd get on the Zoom call and there would be sort of this exchange of pleasantries, but, very quickly, sort of my counterpart would launch in to their entire life story and for like 45 minutes. And many times we never got to the issue that put us at loggerheads in the first place. They were just needing, in the end, really just to be seen and to be heard. And that's what I really realized with many of these conversations is that, people just really want to be seen and to be heard. And that my role wasn't, or my goal, I should say, wasn't to necessarily find agreement or find solution, but to actually find connection and to create the set and setting for safety and for security such that we could have real conversations.
Yeah, you have a great expression, having a conversation for connection versus for agreement. I think as a society, we think, okay, if we're going to talk about a difficult topic, we have to get to agreement.
Right.
Like we need to, that's the metric of a successful, difficult conversation is some form of consensus or agreement. And I think that puts us a little bit into our rational brains too much when really the disconnect or the conflict is at an emotional level. And so in some ways, you kind of were like, oh, okay, adversity mimetics, that's all physiological. And then we're going to talk about this thing that's psychological. But they really aren't that disconnected.
No.
Because ultimately, it's a difficult conversation. Think of that feeling. I mean, I see it in my daughter, who's 2.5 years old, when, well, just how deeply ingrained like shame, like it's not shame, it's like shame, guilt, social, when she trespasses a social bound that my wife and I like set a hard boundary and she hears it in our voice, you can see it in her body. Yeah. The result of it, and then you often have to like go pick her up and like deal with that physiological response. But we're all, that physiological response is in all of us, and it's why non-face-to-face conversations are so dangerous, because we don't experience that. So in some ways, that filter is not quite the right word I want, but that natural tamp down that would prevent us from like being just an asshole to someone in person is not there. And then conversely, when you are with someone face to face, being able to manage your physiology to keep going
Yeah,
is also a skill.
totally. I mean, there's the quote that's often attributed to Brene Brown, but many people have said it. It's hard to hate up close. Lean in, right? So it is really hard to hate up close. And what I started to realize is that my role in these conversations was more about creating, sort of um, sort of a parasympathetic setting, if you will, such that people really felt like safe and secure and could be heard and could be seen without being judged. So that was like another, piece of it. And I'll just say, like, if people are like thinking about like techniques, one of the things that I started doing was, as I was listening, I would start to jot down areas of convergence between their life and mine. And these were like of the most anodyne variety. It's like, oh, you were born in Chicago? Okay, I'm gonna write that down. I was born in Chicago. Like you have daughters? I have daughters. Okay. Or like, oh, I drove cross country. My car broke down. Okay, da da da. And then after they had sort of exhausted themselves, I'd be like, oh, that's so funny. I was born in Chicago and my parents went to Evanston Township. And oh, really? And then you basically just find these places of connection and convergence without really, any mind to, solution and agreement. Now, maybe you get to the solution and agreement eventually, but the first place, was connection. And then you're absolutely right. It was also really about hearing people's feelings, creating that environment such that people could express their feelings. And, this is a core tenet of NVC, of nonviolent communication, is that once you understand people's feelings, then it's easier to meet their needs, essentially.
Yeah, you find the needs that are underneath the feelings.
That's right. And, if you really want to continue to take it along that path, um, you try to elicit a sort of a clear ask of like, what can I deliver to you that will meet that need, underneath that feeling? And that is a skill, a kind of a bi-directional skill. It's one around really listening, and then it's also one about being able to articulate your own asks and needs very clearly.
Well, and there's a separation between needs, feelings, and then opinions. And one of the big problems with identity politics is that your identity is tied up in your opinions. And that is a skill that we've lost, is the ability to separate opinions and identity such that you can change your opinions without feeling like you are fundamentally having to give up who you are. And honestly, we just don't see that role modeled at all in the media anymore.
Yeah.
We don't have difficult conversations. We avoid them kind of even in our own friend groups, our own family groups, but then also we don't even see that modeled.
Well, they're
at all.
Often not accepted. I mean, one of the bases for liberal democracy was this marketplace of ideas, where you could really, vociferously and vehemently debate issues, and, let the best ideas sort of cream to the top. And then, okay, we'll execute around that idea. That doesn't work. Okay, we'll execute around a different idea.
Or part of your ideas get merged together into new ideas that combine multiple viewpoints, etc.
I mean, I think one of the problems with identity politics is that it demands like an adherence to a particular orthodoxy. That's really one of the problems, candidly, on the left, even though I do self-identify as a progressive, but I can also see, that it demands this sort of adherence to an orthodoxy such that if you do have diverging opinions, you're scared to articulate them, because you don't want to be ostracized or canceled or doxxed or whatever. So, this is a real problem, I think, in our society, and it's why we need to, I think, refine these skills
Well,
for having these conversations that sort of stand between us and where we want to be.
yeah, so let's talk skills for a minute, because one of the interesting commusings that you wrote was about straw manning and steel manning. And I think it's worth taking a minute to just like define those terms and that practice, because I will call it's a mindfulness practice in its own sense.
Hmm. It's been a little time since I've really thought about it, but straw manning, as I understand it, is essentially, you're assigning, um, there's someone with whom you disagree, and essentially you're assigning sort of a specious argument to them, and then you knock it down very easily as if they were a man made of straw, a straw man. So you might say, we need more funding for the arts in our schools or whatever. That might be your statement. And then if I were to straw man that, I would be like, oh, you just want to waste money on arts and education. You don't even care about math and science or whatever. That would be basically, me straw manning that. It's not really what you meant or said, but it was an easy position
Yeah,
for me to
make it
refute.
about that. Okay, well, that means that you're against math and science,
Right.
when that wasn't at all part of what I was saying. Okay.
Right. So that would be straw manning, man made of straw, easy to knock down, right? Very difficult to knock down a man of steel. And I don't love these names because, steel man sounds a little patriarchal. But anyways, but a steel manning, when you're steel manning someone, basically what you're doing is you're listening to their argument, and then in response, you're not actually giving a rebuttal to that argument. What you're actually is reciting the best parts of your adversary's argument. So it's pretty interesting because in many ways it can steal or fortify your own initial position, because what you're having to do is actually digest the best part of someone else's argument.
And then you may realize you still disagree for X, Y, and Z reason. And then your argument is so much more powerful. Or you change your argument.
Yeah,
a bit.
you moderate.
Yeah.
Generally, I think that's what happens. You're like, oh, I do see that nuance, and I still kind of hold to my position, but someone else's position wasn't as fatuous as I might have thought. And I think through this process you can moderate and find common ground and move a little bit towards the middle. And I think this is like so important when it's interesting to talk about theoretically, but when you apply this to these salient issues like abortion or immigration, and you start to then like ask the questions behind the questions, et cetera, you find that we all often share the same ultimate desire, but we're coming at it from different places. Like, with immigration, like,
yeah, weirdly, I was also going to go to immigration.
yeah, well, it's just, it's on the front page of every, newspaper above the fold right now. And so, like, okay, the typical more liberal, approach to it is like, there's a Emma Lazarus poem on a statue in the New York Harbor that was basically bring us your huddled masses. Is like, this is the, the land of possible dreams, and we are
We're
immigrants.
all immigrants, yeah.
And it's like, unless you're, were brought here against your will or a Native American, then you're an immigrant, and we need to be that shining star on the hill for people, around the world that face, oppression and political refugees, et cetera. So, okay, fine. And then, there's an opposing viewpoint that, there's a lot of people coming into our country, they're stealing our jobs, they're, maybe have criminal intent, et cetera. We have, it's a difficult enough time to provide, for our own citizens of this country, and we can't just have this ridiculous porous border. Now, both sides of this argument kind of look down their nose with indignation at the other side often, and you're just screaming in an echo chamber. But I guess what I have tried to do with this, is, I have a particular view on immigration, but aside from getting into this particular issue in detail on this podcast, I think there's a unifying question to be asked of, like, what are the ground conditions that exist that would compel someone to leave their home, to leave their family, and to go to a strange land that doesn't speak their language, that doesn't want them? What are those ground conditions that would compel someone to do that? I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity for compassion there.
And what are the ground conditions that make someone feel that so unsafe by these people coming into the country? Regardless of whether you want to trot out statistics around crime rates or economic rates, which I think is a very interesting conversation of itself, and would speak to like my personal position on it, but again, not relevant for the conversation right here. Understanding, again, it comes back to connecting to understand versus to solve the problem, and then hope potentially a solution will come out of that. Oh, well, actually the issue is that you feel really like threatened and insecure by like the current economic state and cultural state of the country. That's a different conversation necessarily than actual border policy.
Yeah. And I think,
but we aren't seeing that conversation. Like that conversation is not happening on cable news.
No. I mean, honestly, I think a lot of this needs to take place off of social media. I don't think social media is honestly a very hospitable sandbox for these kinds of conversations. I think they do need to happen. I mean, they don't necessarily need to happen in 4-dimensional space-time, though that is the best way to do them. They can happen on Zoom, but they do need, I think, to happen within an environment of safety and security where, people can have the time to express themselves and really, be heard. And so in a way, it's a very personal endeavor. That's why I think of it as an adversity mimetic, honestly. Like, and this is why I really encourage people that are listening to try this, to not shy away from stressful conversations, but to lean into them. Because if you can hold these conversations with strangers and people that you don't even know, just think of how important they could be to unresolved trauma in your own family, or the conversations that we avoid, with our siblings or our loved ones or our parents before they pass away. I mean, this is why, leaning into these stressful conversations can be like, honestly, bend the arc of your life.
Well, and what I think is interesting here is you talk about, for example, cold therapy. These are self-imposed protocols because our culture makes it difficult. For example, bringing our conversation full circle, Paleolithic times, you didn't have a choice. You had to have that FaceTime conversation with someone you disagreed with because they were in your tribe, etc. You had to jump in the cold lake because, your food was floating away, or whatever it was, you were there, or just it was cold outside. Our culture has made it increasingly difficult. Like these conversations don't come up in day-to-day life anymore. And so I think what I'm hearing as a call to action from you is you actually have to potentially go out of your way to have some of these conversations in a productive forum. Because I'm thinking about my day-to-day life. Interestingly, the jiu-jitsu studio is one of the few places where I feel like bubble hopping, to use that term from, I feel like, a few years ago. Otherwise, it's the Thanksgiving dinner table is the other like place that it happens, is when extended. And that's why, come that time of year, there's so much stress. Yeah. So yeah, it's happening around your extended family dinner table, but to prepare for that, you might have to actually go out of your way, the same way that you have to go out of your way to get into a cold tub or go exercise.
Yeah, 100%. And uh, I will say, of all the adversity mimetics, this one may be the most important and the most powerful. Um, because I do believe it is these stressful conversations that really separate us between kind of where we are and the world that we know is possible, both on a grandiose scale but also on a very, very personal scale, within our own families. So yeah, I urge everyone to lean into these conversations, and to the degree that you can educate yourself on some of the techniques for doing so, you'll probably be better off. It'll be more equipped going in. And, a lot of those are the core tenets of nonviolent communication, but, really like, you know, listen to understand and not to respond. So really listen to, to really understand someone's point without sort of forming that rebuttal in your head while someone else is talking. Listen, and then actually take a pause and then form your rejoinder. It's a very Japanese,
Yeah, I was
actually.
going to
Yeah.
say, you give that kind of anecdote a lot, that you used to go to Japan quite a bit for business and would always be very concerned when they.
Yeah, we have to fill I would pitch something, and then there would be the Japanese executive on the other side of the desk. And when I was done pitching, there would be this extended silence. And, being an American, I was not used to, that extended silence. So I felt like I needed to fill the space. So then I would just keep talking. But really, what is custom there is, that silence was actually a demonstration of respect, such that, my meeting partner was indicating that he or she had listened to everything that I had to say, and then was taking this pause to then formulate their response. And I found it to be fascinating once I actually learned what was happening, and then allowed that space to exist. So that's one,
Okay,
listen to understand, not to respond. Set and setting, create that safe and secure space. That might be honestly just the physical space itself. That might be, scheduling something in a way that allows for plenty of time. But, that also might be a declaration of intention at the beginning of like, hey, I'm really here to listen to what you have to say, and I'm not here to change your mind about anything. And then it might also even be just like a somatic practice at the beginning of a conversation of like taking some deep breaths and actually moving into that parasympathetic state, such that, you're not feeling all of this epinephrine and adrenaline and cortisol as you're entering the conversations. You're not coming at it from a place of threat, So,
And then the last one is listen for the needs.
listen for the needs, and then really seek connection and not agreement or solution, and find those places of convergence. I mean, for me, over that period in 2020, I made what I call frenemies, people that I didn't agree with, that I still don't agree with, but that I text with, on a relatively not a consistent basis anymore, but every once in a while, I'll get a text from, super pro Trump forever Sue from Susquehanna, Pennsylvania, who'll send me like a photo or a link or something like that. And, we don't agree politically, but we have sort of a fun, lighthearted, repartee. And she actually gave me a tremendous window into why like he is such a popular political figure amongst some demographics. And it really helped me to understand. And the same is true, for people all over the political spectrum. It gave me a much greater window into understanding, you know, where people were coming from. And again, you know, it's like, you know, we need to move, in my mind, you know, we talk about balance as being a reflection of health, of always finding that equilibrium, that center place. And I think through stressful conversations, we can better find that center place, better cooperation, and more common ground.
Amen. Let's hope we get more of it.
Hey, thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then I think you'll love this one too.